When I turned 71, I had $3.2 million sitting quietly in my bank account, and I thought that meant I was safe, that I had done everything right, that I had built a life no one could take from me. But that was the morning my phone rang, and everything I believed about safety, about family, about love, collapsed without a sound. The call came just after 8, while I was standing in my kitchen, measuring out coffee the way I had every morning for the past 40 years, 2-level scoops, no more, no less. The same ritual I had shared with my son Daniel since he was old enough to reach the counter. And for a moment, I almost let it go to voicemail because I didn't recognize the number, but something in me paused, something small and quiet, and I answered. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, distant, the kind of voice that doesn't belong in ordinary mornings. And as he spoke, I felt the world narrow, not shatter, not explode, just narrow, like a hallway closing in from both sides, until there was nothing left but his words and the sound of my own breathing. When the call ended, I didn't scream, I didn't drop the phone, I didn't cry. I simply set it down on the counter next to the coffee jar and stood there, staring at the sunlight coming through the window, as if it had made some kind of mistake, as if the day itself hadn't realized what had just happened. Daniel was gone, my only child, the one person who still called me every Sunday without fail, the one who made sure I never felt alone even after his father passed. And yet the house around me didn't change. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, the coffee maker blinked 12 as it always did after a power flicker. Everything continued exactly as it had been, and that was the strangest part, how nothing seemed to acknowledge that my life had just been split into before and after. I don't remember driving to the house he shared with Vanessa, but I remember the front door being open, voices inside, low and controlled, and when I stepped in, people turned to look at me, then quickly looked away, as if I had entered at the wrong moment of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Vanessa was standing near the window, her back straight, her hair perfectly in place, her phone in her hand, and when she saw me, she walked over and wrapped her arms around me in a gesture that felt rehearsed, precise, like something practiced in front of a mirror, and I noticed, in a way I couldn't explain at the time, that her eyes were dry. I told myself people grieve differently, that shock can look like calm, that not everyone falls apart the same way. But as the hours passed, I began to notice small things, the way she kept stepping outside to take calls, the way her voice dropped when she thought no one was close enough to hear, the way her hand tightened around her phone whenever someone mentioned Daniel's name. And once, as I stood in the hallway just out of sight, I heard her say softly, almost under her breath, "It's almost done," and something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make me realize that whatever had happened that morning had not ended with that phone call. It had only begun. I stayed in that house longer than I should have, long enough for the afternoon light to fade into something colder, long enough for the voices to settle into quiet conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room, and long enough for the realization to take root that I was no longer at the center of anything that mattered there. The living room filled with people I barely knew, distant relatives, neighbors, colleagues from Daniel's work, all speaking in careful tones, offering condolences that sounded rehearsed, as if grief had a script and everyone had agreed to follow it except me. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my hands folded in my lap, listening more than speaking, watching the way Vanessa moved through the room with a kind of controlled efficiency, thanking people, guiding conversations, even reminding someone about arrangements that had not yet been officially discussed. And every time she passed by me, she placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, just enough to be seen, just enough to look like care, but never enough to feel real. At one point, she sat beside me and said we would take care of everything, that I should not worry about a thing, and I nodded because that is what people expect you to do in moments like that, to accept help, to surrender control. But something about the way she said everything made it sound less like reassurance and more like a decision that had already been made. Later, when the house had quieted and most of the visitors had gone, I walked down the hallway toward Daniel's office, a room he had always kept slightly closed, not locked, just private, and for a moment I hesitated at the door, unsure if I was allowed to enter anymore, unsure of what rules had changed without anyone telling me. The room looked untouched, his desk still organized in the precise way he preferred, a legal pad aligned perfectly with the edge, a pen placed parallel beside it, His laptop closed, and for a second I could almost believe he would walk in and ask me why I was standing there. But instead I noticed something else, a drawer slightly open, just enough to break the symmetry he cared so much about. I pulled it open slowly and found documents inside, neatly stacked, some familiar bank statements, insurance papers, things I knew existed, and others I did not recognize, folders labeled in a handwriting that was not his, sharper, more deliberate, and I felt that same quiet shift again, the one that had started in the hallway earlier. Before I could look further, I heard footsteps behind me, and Vanessa's voice, calm and measured, asking if I needed anything. And when I turned, she was standing in the doorway, not surprised, not upset, just watching, her expression unreadable in a way that felt practiced. I told her I was just looking, that I wanted to feel close to him, and she smiled, a small, polite smile, and stepped forward to close the drawer with a gentle push, as if protecting something fragile, then said we should get some rest because tomorrow would be a long day, that there would be meetings, decisions, paperwork, all the things that follow after something like this. And again she said we, but I noticed she never once asked what I wanted, never once paused to see if I agreed. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of a house that was not mine, replaying every word, every gesture, every small detail that did not quite fit. And somewhere between midnight and morning, I stopped thinking about what I had lost and started thinking about what was being taken. And for the first time since that phone call, I understood that grief was not the only thing waiting for me in the days ahead. The next morning did not arrive with clarity or comfort. It arrived with schedules, phone calls, and a kind of quiet urgency that seemed to move around me rather than include me. And by the time I walked into the kitchen, Vanessa was already there, dressed neatly, her hair pulled back, a legal pad in front of her with a list written in that same sharp handwriting I had seen in Daniel's office. And she looked up at me with a smile that felt more like acknowledgement than warmth, as if I were someone expected but not entirely necessary. She told me she had spoken with the funeral home, that arrangements were underway, that certain decisions had been made to keep things efficient, and I stood there listening, noticing how each sentence was structured to sound considerate while leaving no space for my input, no pause where I could say that I might want something different. And when I finally asked about a detail, something small, the time of the service, she answered immediately, smoothly, as if she had anticipated the question and prepared the answer in advance. I poured myself coffee and sat across from her, watching the way she checked her phone between sentences, her thumb moving quickly across the screen, her expression tightening for just a second before returning to that same composed calm. And then it happened again, that small shift in tone when she leaned slightly away from me and spoke into the phone in a lower voice. Not enough to be secretive, but enough to be selective. And I heard her say, "We are almost ready, just waiting on the final confirmation." And when she noticed me watching, she ended the call with a quick smile and explained it was about paperwork, that there were forms to complete, accounts to notify, things that needed to be handled quickly before delays caused complications. The word accounts settled in my mind in a way I could not ignore, not after what I had seen in the drawer, not after the way she had closed it so carefully, and I asked, as evenly as I could, which accounts she meant, and she responded without hesitation, saying she had already contacted Daniel's financial advisor, that it was standard procedure, that she was simply making sure everything transitioned smoothly. And there it was again, that word we, that quiet assumption that everything would pass through her hands first before reaching anyone else. Later that morning, a man arrived at the house, introduced as someone from the bank, and Vanessa greeted him at the door with a familiarity that suggested this was not their first conversation, and I stood a few steps behind, listening as they discussed documents, signatures, verification processes, all in terms that sounded routine but felt increasingly deliberate. And when the man glanced at me, Vanessa quickly introduced me as Daniel's mother, her voice polite but efficient, and then shifted the conversation back to what needed to be done, as if my role had already been defined and limited to observation. I noticed the way she positioned herself slightly in front of me, not physically blocking me, but guiding the direction of every exchange, answering questions before they reached me, clarifying details I had not yet been asked, and I realized that this was not something new, not something that had started after the call. It was something that had been building quietly, step by step, decision by decision, until now it looked like control, but felt like something much deeper. When the man left, Vanessa turned to me and said everything was under control, that I should not worry about finances, that Daniel had made sure I would be taken care of, and I nodded again, because that was what I had done my entire life, trusted, believed, allowed the people I loved to lead when they said they were protecting me. But as I sat there with my coffee growing cold in my hands, I thought about the drawer, the handwriting, the phone calls, the way she had said almost done, and for the first time, I did not feel like someone being taken care of. I felt like someone being managed, and that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything. That afternoon, while Vanessa continued making calls and checking items off her list with the same steady rhythm, I found myself drifting through the house as if I were walking through someone else's memory, touching things that no longer seemed to belong to me, noticing details I had overlooked for years, and slowly, quietly, the past began to rearrange itself into something I could no longer ignore. I remembered a conversation Daniel and I had shared nearly a year ago, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, the same table where he had once done his homework as a boy, his long fingers tapping lightly against a coffee mug as he hesitated before speaking. And when he finally did, his voice had carried a weight I had not recognized at the time. He had asked me if I still kept all my accounts separate, if I had updated my beneficiaries, if I trusted anyone to make decisions on my behalf if something unexpected happened, and I had laughed gently, telling him he worried too much, that everything was in order, that I had spent a lifetime making sure of that. And he had nodded, but not with relief, more with resignation, as if he had expected that answer and wished it had been different. I remembered the way he glanced toward the doorway when Vanessa walked in that day, how his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, how the conversation ended without resolution, and at the time I had told myself it was nothing, just the natural tension that comes and goes in any marriage. But now, standing in his house, watching the patterns unfold around me, I began to see that moment for what it was, not an isolated concern, but part of something larger that I had chosen not to see. There were other moments too, small ones that had seemed harmless at the time. Vanessa offering to organize documents because Daniel was too busy, Vanessa suggesting they consolidate accounts for convenience, Vanessa gently correcting him in conversations about finances as if she were the one keeping track of everything, and each time I had admired her for being attentive, for being involved, for supporting my son in ways I thought were helpful, and each time Daniel had smiled in that same quiet way, not arguing, not agreeing, simply allowing things to move forward without resistance. I remembered one evening when he called me later than usual, his voice low, asking if I still had the contact information for the family attorney who had handled my husband's estate, and when I asked why, he paused just long enough to make me curious, then said it was nothing urgent, just something he wanted to review, and I had given him the number without pressing further, trusting that if it mattered, he would tell me more. Now, that memory settled differently, not as a simple request, but as a signal I had missed, a quiet attempt to prepare for something he could not fully say out loud. I sat down in the living room, the same room where Vanessa had been directing conversations earlier, and looked around at the carefully arranged furniture, the polished surfaces, the subtle order that made everything appear stable and controlled. And I realized that control had been building here long before that morning, long before the phone call, long before I stepped into this house and felt like a guest in my own family. Vanessa's voice carried from the kitchen again, calm and efficient, discussing timelines, confirmations, next steps, and as I listened, I understood that she was not reacting to what had happened. She was continuing something that had already been set in motion, something Daniel had seen, something he had tried, in his quiet way, to prepare me for, and I had missed it because I believed that love was enough to keep everything honest, because I believed that family meant safety, and now, sitting there with those memories lining up one after another, I felt something shift inside me again, not grief, not confusion, but clarity, the kind that comes slowly and settles deeply, the kind that does not ask for permission before changing the way you see everything that came before. By the time evening settled over the house, the pattern was no longer something I was trying to understand. It was something I could see, clearly and completely, in the way Vanessa moved, in the way decisions were made without discussion, in the way my presence was acknowledged but never truly included, and I realized that if I continued to sit quietly and observe without acting, I would soon become nothing more than a detail in a story that no longer belonged to me. That realization did not come with anger. It came with a kind of stillness, the same stillness I had felt that morning when I set my phone down and watched the sunlight as if it had made a mistake. But this time, the stillness carried something else with it, something sharper, something deliberate. I began to pay closer attention, not just to what Vanessa said, but to what she did not say, to the gaps between her words, to the way she redirected conversations whenever they moved too close to specifics. And it did not take long to notice that every path led back to the same place, the same quiet consolidation of control that had been building long before I ever realized it was happening. Later that night, after she had retreated to her room and the house had fallen into that careful silence again, I returned to Daniel's office, closing the door behind me this time, not out of secrecy, but out of intention, and I opened the drawer she had so gently shut earlier. The documents inside were arranged too precisely to be casual, each folder labeled, each paper aligned, and as I began to go through them, I noticed dates that did not match what I remembered, signatures that felt out of place, transfers that had been executed in ways that suggested planning rather than necessity. And although I did not yet understand the full picture, I understood enough to know that none of this had happened suddenly. There were notes in the margins, brief, efficient, written in that same sharp hand, references to meetings, confirmations, steps completed and steps pending. And as I read through them, I realized that what I had overheard earlier, the phrase "it is almost done," was not about grief, not about arrangements, but about something far more structured, something that had been moving forward piece by piece, quietly, carefully, until now. I sat down in Daniel's chair, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel the absence again, not as a wave of emotion, but as a steady presence, the understanding that he was not here to explain any of this, not here to confirm what I was beginning to suspect. And yet, in a strange way, I felt closer to him in that moment than I had all day, as if the silence he had carried in those conversations we once shared was now finally speaking through the details he had left behind. I closed the folders carefully, returning everything to its place exactly as I had found it, because I understood that whatever this was, it was not something to confront directly. Not yet, not without knowing more. And as I stood to leave the room, I caught my reflection in the darkened window, the faint outline of a woman who looked exactly as she had that morning and yet was no longer the same. I was no longer trying to understand what was happening to me. I was beginning to understand what had already been set in motion, and more importantly, I was beginning to understand that if I wanted to remain anything more than an afterthought in the life I had built, I would have to stop waiting for someone else to explain it to me and start seeing it for myself. The next day began with a quiet decision, not announced, not visible to anyone else, but firm enough that it changed the way I moved through the house, the way I listened, the way I responded, and for the first time since I arrived, I stopped reacting and started choosing. Vanessa was already at the dining table when I walked in, her notes spread neatly in front of her, a cup of coffee untouched beside her hand, and she looked up with that same composed expression, asking if I had slept well, as if rest were something that could be measured and reported like any other detail on her list. I told her I had, and I took a seat across from her, mirroring her calm, matching her tone, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not concern, not warmth, but recognition, as if she were recalibrating her expectations of me. She began, outlining the day again, meetings, calls, documents that needed to be signed, timelines that could not be delayed, and this time, instead of interrupting or questioning, I simply listened and nodded, allowing her to believe that nothing had changed, that I was still the same woman who had stood in that kitchen the morning before, uncertain and willing to be guided. When she mentioned that we would need to review certain financial documents together later, I agreed without hesitation, even adding that I trusted her judgment, that I appreciated everything she was doing to keep things organized, and the effect was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, her voice softened just enough to suggest satisfaction, and I understood then that she had been expecting resistance, or at least hesitation, and that my compliance was something she welcomed more than she would ever admit. The rest of the morning unfolded exactly as she described. Calls made, confirmations received, small decisions handled efficiently, and I remained present but passive, observing the rhythm of her process, the order in which she prioritized tasks, the people she contacted first, the information she shared, and the details she kept to herself. And slowly, piece by piece, the structure of what she was doing became clearer, not through any single revelation, but through accumulation, through the consistency of her choices. At one point, she stepped out onto the back patio to take another call, and this time, I followed at a distance, not close enough to be seen, but close enough to hear, and her voice dropped again into that same controlled quiet, discussing timelines, approvals, and something about final authorization. And although I could not hear every word, I did not need to, because the pattern was already there, the repetition of intent, the steady movement towards something she believed was within reach. When she returned inside, she smiled at me, asking if I needed anything, and I shook my head, thanking her again, reinforcing the image she seemed to prefer. And as the day moved forward, I noticed something else, something even more important than the documents or the calls. I noticed that she never once asked what I planned to do, never once considered that I might have my own decisions to make, my own steps to take, and that assumption, that quiet certainty that I would remain within the boundaries she had set, became the most valuable piece of information I had gained. That evening, as she prepared to review the documents she had mentioned earlier, she placed them carefully on the table between us, explaining each one with the same practiced clarity, guiding me through them as if I were being helped rather than directed, and I listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, asking small, harmless questions, never pushing too far, never revealing how much I had already begun to understand. And when she finally slid the first paper toward me, indicating where I should sign when the time came, I placed my hand lightly on the edge of the table and looked at her, not with suspicion, not with challenge, but with the same quiet acceptance she had come to expect. And in that moment, I realized that whatever game had been unfolding around me, I was no longer outside of it, I was inside it, and for the first time, I was playing. The moment after she placed the documents in front of me stretched longer than it should have, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not say, the quiet expectation hanging between us that I would follow the path she had already drawn, that I would sign when told, trust when prompted, and move forward without asking the kinds of questions that might slow things down. I let my fingers rest lightly on the paper, tracing the edge without reading too closely, allowing her to continue explaining each section in that steady, practiced voice. And as she spoke, I watched her instead of the words, the way her eyes moved to check my reaction, the way her tone adjusted slightly when she thought I might hesitate, and I realized that this was not just about control, it was about timing. About guiding me to a point where agreement felt easier than resistance. I nodded when she paused, asking small, harmless questions about process rather than substance, and each time I did, she answered quickly, confidently, reinforcing the idea that everything was already understood, already decided, already in motion. When she finally stopped speaking, she slid a pen toward me, not insistently, not forcefully, just enough to suggest that the next step was obvious. And I picked it up, holding it between my fingers as if I were considering it, then set it back down gently and said that I would like a little more time, that I wanted to review everything carefully, not because I did not trust her, but because I had always been thorough with matters like this. And for the first time, I saw something shift in her. Expression, not frustration, not anger, but a brief tightening, a recalculation. She recovered quickly, of course, smiling again, telling me that was completely reasonable, that there was no rush, even though everything she had done suggested the opposite, and I thanked her, reinforcing the calm, the cooperation, the version of myself she believed she understood. That night, after she had gone to bed, I did not return to Daniel's office immediately. Instead, I sat at the dining table where she had laid everything out, and I began to read, slowly, carefully, not just the main documents, but the details, the footnotes, the clauses that most people would skim past, and as I moved through them, I began to see the shape of it more clearly, the way authority was being transferred, the way decisions were being centralized, the way certain protections were being minimized or removed entirely, all in language that sounded routine but carried consequences that were anything but. There were references to joint oversight that did not include me, provisions for management that placed control firmly in her hands, timelines that favored immediate action rather than reflection, and none of it was accidental, none of it was rushed. It was precise, intentional, and designed to look ordinary. I leaned back in my chair, the papers spread out in front of me, and thought about Daniel again, about the questions he had asked, about the quiet concern in his voice, and I understood now that whatever he had been trying to protect me from, it had not ended with him. It had simply lost its only obstacle. The house was silent around me, the kind of silence that feels complete until you realize it is only hiding what has not yet been said, and I gathered the documents into a neat stack, aligning them exactly as she had, returning everything to its place, because I knew that tomorrow, and the day after that, and the days that followed, this would continue, the same careful guidance, the same quiet pressure, the same expectation of agreement, and I also knew that I would continue to nod, to listen, to appear exactly as she expected, because for the first time, I understood that the only way to see how far something goes is to let it keep moving, and the only way to know where it ends is to be there when it does. The next morning, I made a small change that no one else would have noticed, but it altered everything that followed. I stopped waiting for Vanessa to tell me what the day would look like, and instead, I asked her first, in the same calm tone she used with me, what she thought our next step should be, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not obvious, but there, in the brief pause before she answered, as if she had not expected me to move ahead of her even in something so simple. She recovered quickly, of course, outlining the same sequence of tasks, the same meetings and calls, but this time, I nodded before she finished, agreeing with her suggestions as if they had been my own idea, and I watched carefully as that subtle shift settled in, as she began to see me not as someone to guide, but as someone who had already accepted the direction she was setting. Throughout the morning, I leaned into that role, asking her opinion on details I already understood, thanking her for managing things I had begun to question, reinforcing the version of me she believed was easiest to control, and with each interaction, her confidence grew, her movements becoming slightly more relaxed, her tone just a fraction more open, as if she no longer felt the need to measure every word quite as carefully. It was not trust, not really, but it was something close enough to it that she allowed herself to move more freely, and that was what I needed. By midday, she suggested we finalize some of the documents we had reviewed the night before, explaining that it would simplify everything moving forward, and I agreed without hesitation, even adding that I was grateful she was handling things so efficiently. And again, I saw that same quiet satisfaction in her expression, the confirmation that things were progressing exactly as she intended. When we sat down at the table, she arranged the papers in front of me with practiced precision, guiding me through each section again, but this time with less explanation, as if she assumed I no longer needed it, and I followed along, nodding at the right moments, asking only the simplest questions, never challenging, never slowing the pace she had set. At one point, she excused herself to take a call, stepping just far enough away that she believed she could speak freely, and I remained seated, my eyes on the documents, my attention on the rhythm of her voice as it carried faintly through the room, and I heard her say it again, that same phrase. Almost done, just a few more steps, and this time, there was something else in her tone, something lighter, something that sounded almost like relief. When she returned, I looked up and smiled, thanking her again, telling her I trusted her completely, and she smiled back, more genuinely than before, as if the distance between us had finally closed in her mind, as if whatever uncertainty she had been holding on to had now disappeared. That afternoon, I followed her lead through every task, every call, every small decision, never resisting, never questioning, and by the time evening arrived, the pattern had shifted in a way that only one of us fully understood. She believed she was guiding me to an outcome she had carefully planned, while I was allowing her to reveal every step of that plan without realizing it. Later, when the house grew quiet again, I sat alone with the documents once more, not reading them for the first time, but reading them differently, not as someone trying to understand what was being asked of me, but as someone preparing for what would come next. And as I turned each page, I no longer felt uncertain or overwhelmed. I felt steady, deliberate, aware of the path unfolding in front of me, and more importantly, aware that I was no longer being carried along it. I was choosing to walk it, step by step, all the way to wherever it ended. By the next morning, the pace had changed again, not because Vanessa pushed harder, but because she no longer felt the need to, and that difference, subtle as it was, told me more than anything she had said so far. She moved through the house with quiet confidence, her calls shorter, her explanations lighter, as if the outcome she had been working toward was no longer uncertain, but simply waiting to be finalized, and I matched her rhythm exactly, offering no resistance, no hesitation, no sign that I saw anything beyond what she chose to show me. When she suggested that we meet with a notary that afternoon to formalize everything, I agreed immediately, even thanking her for arranging it so quickly. And this time, she did not hide her satisfaction. It was there in the way she nodded, in the slight lift of her voice, in the way she gathered the documents with a sense of completion rather than preparation. The drive to the office was quiet, the kind of silence that feels settled rather than strained, and I sat beside her, watching the passing streets without really seeing them, thinking instead about the path that had brought us here, about the careful sequence of steps that had unfolded so smoothly it almost felt inevitable, and I understood that this moment, this meeting, was not the beginning of anything. It was the end of something she believed had already been secured. The office itself was modest, clean, professional, the kind of place designed to make important decisions feel routine, and the man who greeted us spoke in the same calm, neutral tone I had heard before, guiding us through the process as if it were just another appointment in an ordinary day. Vanessa took the lead immediately, handing over the documents, summarizing what needed to be done, answering questions before they were fully asked, and I allowed it, sitting quietly, listening, nodding when appropriate, reinforcing the image she had come to rely on. When the papers were placed in front of me, one by one, each requiring acknowledgement, each moving things a little further along, I took my time, not enough to cause concern, but enough to maintain the appearance of care, reading just enough to justify the pause, then looking up with a small, reassuring smile before continuing. Vanessa watched me closely at first, then less so, her attention shifting toward the man across the table, toward the final steps, the confirmations, the signatures that would complete what she had started. At one point, she leaned slightly toward him, her voice low but clear enough for me to hear, saying that everything was straightforward, that there were no complications, and in that moment, I realized that she truly believed it, that whatever doubts she might have had before were gone, replaced by the certainty that comes when someone thinks they have accounted for every possibility. I signed where I needed to sign, slowly, deliberately, my hand steady, my expression unchanged, and each time the pen touched the paper, I felt the weight of the moment, not as something I was losing, but as something I was allowing to reach its final form. When it was done, the documents were gathered, reviewed, confirmed, and Vanessa exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if she had been holding her breath for longer than she realized, and she turned to me with that same composed smile, thanking me for trusting her, for making this easy, for understanding what needed to be done. I returned the smile, nodding once, and for a moment, everything appeared exactly as she expected it to be, complete, resolved, settled into place without resistance or interruption, and as we stood to leave, I understood that whatever she believed had just been finalized, whatever she thought she had secured, was only one part of a story that had not yet reached its conclusion, and that the next step, the one she had not planned for, was already waiting. The ride back from the office felt different, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because everything beneath it had settled into place, and Vanessa carried herself with a quiet satisfaction she no longer tried to hide, her posture relaxed, her voice lighter when she spoke, as if a long process had finally reached its natural conclusion. She thanked me again as we walked into the house, repeating how smoothly everything had gone, how grateful she was that I trusted her to handle things, and I nodded, offering the same calm response she had come to expect, allowing her to believe that nothing stood between her and the outcome she had been working toward. The rest of the afternoon passed in a kind of gentle routine, small tasks, brief conversations, the kind of ordinary movement that follows something significant, and I remained consistent, attentive, agreeable, reinforcing every assumption she had made about me, until the moment arrived that she had not anticipated. It came quietly, without announcement, when the front door opened just after 6 in the evening and a man stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase and a presence that did not match the rhythm of the house. Vanessa turned immediately, her expression shifting for the first time in days, not dramatically, but enough for me to see it, the brief hesitation, the calculation that followed, and before she could speak, I stood and walked toward him, greeting him by name. Mr. Howard Klein, the same attorney Daniel had once asked me about, the same one whose number I had given him without understanding why. Vanessa's eyes moved between us, her composure returning quickly, but not completely, and she asked, with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, what this was about. I answered simply, explaining that I had asked him to come, that there were a few things I wanted to review, nothing complicated, just a matter of being thorough, and I saw it then, the shift she could not fully control, the moment where certainty gave way to something else. Mr. Klein set his briefcase on the table, opening it with calm precision, and began to lay out documents of his own, not replacing what had been signed earlier, but standing beside it, parallel, deliberate, and he spoke in a tone that matched mine, steady, measured, explaining that there were existing structures in place that required acknowledgement, protections that had been established prior to recent events, and that any new arrangements would need to be evaluated in that context. Vanessa listened, her posture still composed, her hands resting lightly on the table, but her attention sharpened, her questions more direct now, more specific, as if she were trying to understand where this new information fit into what she believed had already been completed. I remained quiet, allowing the conversation to unfold, watching as the framework she had relied on began to show its limits, not collapsing, not breaking, but revealing edges she had not accounted for. When Mr. Klein referenced certain conditions Daniel had put in place, conditions that required independent oversight, conditions that prevented unilateral control of specific assets, I saw the first real pause in Vanessa's response, the first moment where she did not have an immediate answer, and although she recovered quickly, asking for clarification, requesting details, the rhythm had changed. The certainty had been interrupted. I reached for one of the documents Mr. Klein had placed on the table, running my fingers lightly across the page before looking up, meeting Vanessa's eyes with the same calm expression I had maintained all along. And in that moment, nothing had been taken from her, nothing had been reversed, but something had shifted, something she could feel even if she did not yet fully understand it. And as the conversation continued, I realized that the process she believed had ended that afternoon had not been undone. It had simply been joined by something else, something she had not planned for, something that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Vanessa's composure did not break all at once. It shifted in small, controlled adjustments, the way someone recalibrates when the ground beneath them is not as stable as they believed, and I watched closely as each layer of certainty she had built began to thin, not disappear, but lose the weight it once carried. She asked questions carefully, choosing her words with more precision now, no longer assuming the answers would align with her expectations, and Mr. Klein responded in the same steady tone, explaining details without urgency, outlining structures that had existed before any recent changes, making it clear that what had been done earlier that day was not invalid, but it was not absolute either. I remained quiet, my hands resting lightly on the table, my attention fixed on the rhythm of the conversation rather than the specifics, because it was not the documents themselves that mattered most in that moment. It was the shift in control, the way the balance had moved without force, without confrontation, simply by revealing what had already been there. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her fingers interlacing as she listened, and for the first time, she did not try to guide the direction of the discussion. She allowed it to unfold, and that alone told me more than anything she said. When she did speak, her voice was still calm, still measured, but there was a new layer beneath it, something sharper, something that suggested she was no longer following a plan, but trying to understand where it had changed. She asked about authority, about timing, about whether certain actions could still proceed as intended, and each question was answered with the same clarity, the same careful explanation that introduced limits she had not accounted for, conditions that required more than a single decision, more than a single signature. I watched her process it, not with panic, not with visible frustration, but with a kind of controlled awareness that something had shifted beyond her immediate reach. And for a moment, our eyes met across the table, and in that brief exchange, there was no need for words, because she understood, not everything, but enough to recognize that I was no longer where she had placed me. The room felt different then, not tense, not confrontational, but altered in a way that could not be reversed, as if the story she had been telling herself had reached a point where it could no longer continue without change. Mr. Klein continued outlining next steps, suggesting that certain elements would need to be reviewed more thoroughly, that timelines might need to be adjusted, that oversight would now involve additional layers, and Vanessa nodded. Acknowledging each point, her responses measured, her expression composed, but the ease she had carried earlier was gone, replaced by something more deliberate, more cautious. I spoke only once, and when I did, my voice was steady, almost gentle, as I said that I appreciated everything being handled carefully, that I believed it was important to understand every part of what was happening. And she looked at me again, this time longer, as if trying to reconcile the person she thought I was with the one sitting across from her now. No accusation passed between us, no raised voices, no dramatic shift, just a quiet recognition that the roles we had been playing were no longer aligned. As the meeting came to an end, the documents remained on the table, not finalized in the way she had expected, not undone either, simply suspended in a space that required more than assumption to move forward. And as Mr. Klein gathered his papers and prepared to leave, Vanessa stood as well, her posture still controlled, her expression still composed, but her silence carried a different weight now, one that no longer suggested certainty, but calculation. I remained seated for a moment longer, watching the way the room settled after everything had been said, and I realized that nothing had been taken from her, nothing had been given back to me, but something more important had changed, the understanding of who was making the decisions. And for the first time since I walked into that house, I no longer felt like someone being guided toward an outcome. I felt like someone who had finally stepped into it on my own terms. That night, after the door closed behind Mr. Klein and the house returned to its careful quiet, I did not move right away. I remained at the table, my hands resting lightly on the surface, listening to the silence as if it were something new, something that had changed shape without making a sound. Vanessa stood across from me for a moment longer than necessary, as if she were deciding whether to say something, to reclaim the direction she had held so firmly before, but instead, she gave a small nod, composed, controlled, and turned away, gathering a few of the documents. With deliberate precision, before walking down the hallway without another word, I watched her go, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud, because whatever had existed between us before had already shifted beyond recognition. I remained there until the house settled completely, until even the smallest movements faded, and then I stood, not hurried, not uncertain, just steady, and walked toward the front window, looking out at the darkened street where everything appeared exactly as it always had, unchanged, ordinary, untouched by anything that had happened inside these walls. The reflection in the glass met my eyes again, the same woman, the same face, the same quiet posture, and yet there was something different in the way I held myself, something that did not come from what I had gained or lost, but from what I had finally seen clearly. Grief was still there, steady and present, not louder, not softer, just part of the space I carried with me now, but it no longer defined the way I moved through the world. It no longer made me smaller, or quieter, or easier to overlook. In the days that followed, things did not resolve all at once. There were more conversations, more documents, more careful steps that needed to be taken, and Vanessa adjusted, just as I had, her approach more measured now, her assumptions less certain, but she never returned to the ease she once had, and I never returned to the silence I once kept. We spoke when necessary. We moved through the same spaces, but the balance had changed in a way that did not need to be declared. It simply existed, steady and undeniable. I handled what needed to be handled, reviewed what needed to be reviewed, made decisions that I once would have deferred, not out of defiance, but out of clarity, and with each step, the life I had built began to feel like something that belonged to me again, not something I had to protect quietly, but but something I could stand within without hesitation. Sometimes, in the early morning, I still found myself standing in the kitchen, measuring out coffee the same way I always had. 2-level scoops, no more, no less. The ritual unchanged even when everything else had shifted, and in those moments, I thought about Daniel, about the things he had tried to say without saying them, about the